the message that more people need to hear is the idea that a lot of these originate from natural primal practices that most people could do for free in their own backyard.
Hey, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Welcome to the Secretary Kennedy podcast. My guest today is Ben Greenfield. Ben is a professional athlete, a performance coach, leading voice in nutrition, fitness, and preventative health. He spent years helping people improve their health through diet, exercise, and daily habits, focusing on practical ways to build strength, resilience, and long-term wellness. And I really wanted you on here just to talk about biohacking, but we'll get to that in a minute. Before we started the show, you asked me about the heat in Washington. It's 90 degrees here today. And I said that, that I had been to a gym this morning that didn't have air conditioning.
Yeah.
And it was actually a good thing because it's good to work up a sweat.
Yeah.
You also were saying that it actually builds.
It's
so
there is, of course, like the increased mental demand of working out in the heat. But then if you look at what's occurring physiologically, and this is all fresh on my mind because my 18-year-old son was complaining the other day that the AC wasn't on in our gym at home in Idaho. And I told him the same thing I'll tell you. When you look at increased heat shock protein production, which basically increases cellular resilience. When you look at increased blood volume, which is one of the direct contributors to VO2 max, and probably most interestingly, when you look at what Tour de France riders used to lay down in the back of buses to inject illegally EPO, erythropoietin, like a precursor to red blood cells, all of that increases when you're working out in the heat. So if the AC is not on at the gym, you're basically getting a lot more out of what you're doing at the gym, even though it sucks a lot more.
You're an endurance athlete, right?
Former. I'm sane. Now I'm just kettlebells and walking.
What is the toughest thing that you've done?
I did 13 Ironman triathlons, Ironman World Championships 6 times, raced professionally in obstacle course racing for Spartan for 4 years.
And what is that?
Spartan is burpees and monkey bars and hauling sandbags up the side of mountains because they have every darn race at some kind of a ski resort at altitude, and typically running around a corner and coming face to face with whatever obstacle they've decided to build out in the forest or out in the middle of nowhere. And they range kind of like triathlon does from everywhere from like 30 minutes up to the death race, which was probably one of the harder events that I did, which was 3 days. And that was not in the heat. That was a winter death race, and it was out at the Spartan CEO Joe DeSena's farm in Vermont. And I remember my buddy dropped me off at that race, and his dog wouldn't even get out of the car because the ground was too cold. So it was 38 degrees below zero during the cold snap back east. This would have been like 7 years ago. And it's just 3 days of obstacle course racing.
38 below.
That's not wind chill. That's like on the thermometer, 38 degrees below zero. And that was probably the toughest just because of the thermal management combined with going out and doing obstacles for 3 days in a row. So that's up there.
And how many miles is that?
I have no clue. You're literally just doing random tasks and obstacles for 3 days. I mean, we would, at one point we were in teams and dragging a canoe across a frozen lake, and then, wayfinding and trekking to the top of a mountain.
So they just make stuff
We
up.
probably could. They just make stuff up. Yeah. Half of it, I think, began with someone, with Joe just wanting people to do yard chores at his farm and, chop wood and haul rocks up the mountain.
But the Ironman is standardized.
The Ironman is standardized, 140.6 miles. So you swim 2.4, ride 112, and then run a marathon for dessert.
Yeah, my son did that in Texas last year. I went and watched him compete, which was really extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, they're incredible events. I mean, what I tell people when it comes to those type of slightly masochistic events is they're great for climbing your own personal Mount Everest and building mental resilience, but don't fool yourself into thinking that they're actually a healthy sport, right? You reach there's the so-called Goldilocks zone of exercise where once you exceed about 75 minutes of vigorous physical intensity, and most people don't even do like a minute of vigorous physical intensity per week. So most people don't need to worry about that. Or 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical exercise per week. And this would be kind of like the marathoner triathlete-esque, swim, bike, run protocol. You tend to see increased risk for arterial stiffness or atherosclerosis. So part of that is probably due to the inflammation, the dehydration, some of the chronic repetitive stress on the joints. So Ironman is it's a great goal and a great obstacle, but probably not one of the healthiest ways to stay fit.
I was thinking about that because I saw there's now a woman who's the best long distance runner in the world for the sort of ultra long distance.
Yeah.
These 20-hour, 30-hour race. I think some of them are 50-hour races.
Yeah. And I mean,
And it sounds like it couldn't be good for you.
you know this. I mean, if you like Google image search marathoner versus a sprinter, typically the sprinter has the body that looks a little bit more functional and strong, and appears to be a little bit more resilient. And then, if you even take me, like coming out of Ironman, when I shifted to Spartan racing, I mean, I couldn't carry a gravel bucket up a hill. I didn't know how to climb a rope. I could do like maybe 5 pull-ups. I didn't know how to do monkey bars. You didn't have the mobility to crawl under barbed wire. So for me, it was a wake-up call about the idea that, yeah, you could you could look good in spandex and have a big cardiovascular engine, but that doesn't necessarily translate to well-rounded physical health. Or physical fitness, I should say.
Let's talk about biohacking. I spent a day with Gary Brecka in Miami.
Fun.
At his crazy house.
Right in the bathtub.
He's got everything in that place. It's like a hell spa.
Yes.
But his son was there, and his son had never run a marathon.
Yeah, Cole. Yeah.
And then I think he ran. Do I remember like 7 marathons in 7 days? Or
seven in 7 days on 7 continents.
On 7 different
which
continents.
is the hardest part if you think about getting on an airplane after you raced a marathon. Yeah.
And one of them was in Antarctica. It was really cold. And then he went right up to Egypt, I think, and ran it in the Sahara.
Yeah.
But you
have to have a dad who's a biohacker to pull that off. Yeah.
He was getting biohacked in the airplane the whole way with red lights and everything. And his father kind of did it as an experiment on him to see, because he had never trained for a marathon before.
Yeah.
I was impressed that he could pull that off.
Yeah. If you look at if you look at biohacking, I think that a lot of the benefits of it, if we're going to define biohacking as using science and technology and self-quantification to somehow get the body to do something more quickly or more efficiently than it might be able to do in its native state, that the majority of benefits actually do come from what you were just alluding to, being able to recover faster and being able to rest more deeply. I think when you get into the exercise side of biohacking, there's a lot of perceived shortcuts, right? Like, I'm going to use this fancy machine and get the equivalent of a 3-hour run in a couple of minutes, or attach electrodes to the body with electrical muscle stimulation and build muscle with just a couple 20-minute workouts a week. And
does that stuff work?
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, you could certainly do better than if you were sedentary, but if we're talking about functional strength and resilience, mobility and athleticism, a lot of biohacking tools could maybe be icing on the cake, or something, let's say like electrical muscle stimulation, that you could do if you were injured and unable to move a joint otherwise, or to retrain a muscle that would traditionally be weak. Like the glutes or the inner quad muscle next to the knee, which is where a lot of knee pain originates in people when that's weak. But then if you look at the recovery side, that's where you tend to see a lot of benefit for for longevity in sport and just longevity of the body in general. Everything from hyperbaric oxygen, meaning delivering oxygen into tissues so that you've got the ability to produce more ATP to recover more quickly, or even like a non-pressurized normal baric version of that, like exercising with oxygen therapy, or alternating between hypoxia and hyperoxia using a mask. That's a common exercise modality that can also be used for recovery. Another example would be red light, right? That's probably like the quintessential image that people get in their heads when they think of a biohacker, like laying in a red light bed, or standing in front of a red light panel, or wearing a red light hair growth helmet. And there's actually
does that work?
Difficult to say. Like I use one, and
You got great hair.
yeah, thanks. It's the red light helmet. You could make a case that
Are you bald when you started?
Exactly. Photonic excitation of the follicles or the mitochondria anywhere in the body could theoretically induce some kind of regenerative or growth potential.
Is there any science on
But
it?
one of my friends he's a cosmetic surgeon up in Spokane, and he treats a lot of baldness and receding hairlines. And if you really truly want to grow new hair right now, pretty much gold standard is you need a follicular transplant. And there's certain people that are kind of like experimenting with the idea of like a stamp or a derma roller or a microneedling pen, and then smearing some peptide like GHK copper peptide or some like hair growth stimulant on there combined with red light. But it's all pretty polyanecdotal right now when it comes to hair growth. But back to the red light, that would be an example of something that does actually have evidence for collagen and elastin stimulation, for mitochondrial stimulation, and for recovery. And then one other example would be something like PEMF. You ever use one of those MATs? It's pulsed electromagnetic field therapy is what PEMF stands for. And this is essentially concentrating typically like a 0 to 100 hertz signal onto the body to improve electron flow, which theoretically would improve metabolic waste in and out of a cell to increase recovery or to address a muscle that's in like a cramped or a spasmed state. Now you look at all of those things, like those three examples I gave, which would be pretty common tools that would be called biohacking tools: oxygen, red light, and PEMF. And they could accelerate recovery. They might help out with performance a little bit. But I think that the message that more people need to hear is the idea that a lot of these originate from natural primal practices that most people could do for free in their own backyard. Oxygen, just breathing hard, getting on a bike, going for a run, doing breath work. You can actually, move a lot of CO2 and oxygen just with that alone. Even just deep diaphragmatic breathing during the day, which a lot of people don't do. With PEMF, going outside barefoot, swimming in the ocean, walking on the beach, right? Every time lightning strikes the surface of the planet or solar radiation bombards Earth, it collects negative ions, and your skin is a transdermal surface that can actually conduct electricity into the body. So actually being outside barefoot is good for you. Swimming in the ocean, laying on your back in the backyard and stretching. You don't have to have a fancy PEMF mat for that. Or of course the biggest, most obvious one would be red light. I mean, you get full spectrum light from the sun. And
you get including the red light.
Now, of course, you have to balance that out with UVA and UVB radiation and protect your skin and not burn. But I mean, what I'm getting at is that before anybody goes out and buys like a home soft shell hyperbaric chamber, or Gary Brecka's super cool hard shell one that you can work out in, or uses a PEMF mat or a PEMF tool, or buys a fancy red light bed or red light panel. I mean, go outside, get sunlight, do some breath work, or difficult cardiovascular stimulus for the lungs. So there's a lot of low hanging fruit, is what I'm saying, before you get to biohacking. And I think the message more people need to hear is just like move your body and go outside.
What about peptides?
That would certainly fit into the category of biohacking. So as you know, peptides are super popular right now. I think they're one of the most Googled search terms, recently surpassing pickleball. Um, I use peptides. I've messed around with peptides since 2016. Everything from BPC 157 and TB 500 for injuries, or thymosin alpha 1 for the immune system, or things like SS31 or MOTS-C. They all have Star Wars R2D2 C3PO names, uh, that are difficult to remember. But the idea with peptides is that they're very small chains of amino acids that can act with pretty good precision on specific cellular targets, specific cellular receptors. And they seem to work for a lot of people. I think they also need more research. I think that they're a very promising tool. I've used them successfully for a really long time, but I think
What do you mean successfully?
like injecting a joint that I know would have taken a much longer time to repair if I
Okay.
hadn't used something like BPC 157 or TB 500, or being anxious just due to a high stress workday and using something like intranasal C-Link or injecting C-Link as an anxiolytic. Or even using something like CMAX for improving cognition or verbal fluency, but a lot of this is anecdotal. I think it
But
would be
you think you
nice.
can see a result?
I know I can see a result with peptides. Absolutely, yeah. And of course, I'm not the only one talking about the success that they've had with peptides. I think there just needs to be more research and more structured research done on the safety and efficacy and protocols around peptides. Whether that's probably be the root of something like IRBs, or some type of scenario where a physician, a prescribing physician in a clinic, would be able to actually use peptides, as something like a research study in a safe environment. I think that's a much better route than what's going on to a great extent right now, which is people hear about peptides and then they go and Google peptides and they find them on the gray market, sold for human research. And when you sell something for human research, you're not even allowed to give out prescribing information about it. So people are at home just like trying to figure out how to inject themselves with something safely, because there's very little oversight from a doctor about how to do it. And that's where you hear, the horror stories of somebody just like getting some sepsis like condition because they didn't even know they were supposed to use an alcohol swab on the rubber stopper or on their skin before they pulled something up into a syringe. Or worse yet, getting something that has, no certificate of analysis, and you don't know where it came from, and you don't know the sterility procedure used to produce that peptide. So I think production of peptides and oversight, especially from some kind of a research avenue to figure out what's working and what isn't, and what physician protocols would actually be good to use, is necessary in the peptide world, because it's a little bit of the wild wild west right now. But I don't think they're bad, just having subjectively used them for a long time.
I mean, you could make the same argument on the supplements.
Yeah, yeah,
None of those are tested in clinical trials.
right, exactly.
Um,
Yep.
the FDA only has the authority to regulate drugs that claim a particular indication. And so, as long as they don't claim an indication, they're supposed to be. If a doctor prescribes them, he's supposed to be able to do that without any clinical trials. And
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of doctors still need more education around peptides, though. I mean, a lot of doctors just aren't even familiar with the protocols or what they do. And so yeah, like it's just pretty, they're considered to be, yeah, just kind of like dark and scary and unknown for a lot of doctors. So I think
and stem
education will help
cells.
I've done stem cells. I kind of very similarly, similar to like the biohacking idea from a regenerative standpoint. I've had a lot of good results. For example, from all the crazy masochistic Iron Man stuff, I had full on arthritis in my left knee, and rather than opting for a knee replacement, this was like 7 years ago, super swollen left knee. I couldn't squat, couldn't play tennis, couldn't play pickleball. I wound up getting what's called an intraosseous needling procedure, where doctor essentially like drilled holes, almost like aerating a lawn on the two articulating surfaces in the knee joint, and then filled that with stem cells as like a cartilage regeneration protocol. And my knees are great now, and that's what turned the corner for me. I've also done stem cell infusions and stem cell injections in other joints, and uh, again, I think that it's a pretty nuanced discussion because there's a lot of different forms of stem cells. There are many international clinics where I know people have gotten hurt from a procedure or been infected from a procedure. And they're still like growing multiple generations of stem cell lines at many of those clinics, which increases the carcinogenicity of a stem cell population. Every time that you regrow or re-expand a stem cell line. So I think you need to know where you're getting your stem cells and who's administering them. But I think they hold a lot of promise, particularly for joint regeneration and potentially for organ regeneration.
Anything outside of those categories?
Outside of stem cells, peptides, and supplements, from a biohacking standpoint, I think the idea, if we want to look at it from maybe like a central nervous system, vagus nerve, anxiolytic standpoint, there's a lot in the category of brainwave entrainment or relaxation, or even downregulation of the default mode network, the type of things that people would often look for or look to opioids, muscle relaxants, diazepams, or even from a default mode network, plant medicines to achieve from a mental standpoint that you can stimulate with technology. Like if you look at the vagus nerve, for example, I don't know if you wear a device or measure your heart rate variability or recovery or anything like that, but HRV is a commonly measured metric for recovery. It's the delta between each heartbeat. So the idea is that if you have a lot of variation in between each beat of your heart, you have high heart rate variability, and if it's very, very mild or low beat to beat variation, you have low heart rate variability. And high HRV is an indicator that the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of your nervous system are communicating well with the sinoatrial nodes of your heart, like basically with your cardiac pacemaker cells. And if that occurs, that's a good sign that you're recovered. And if you're very stressed and you're engaging in shallow breathing throughout the day, and you're just basically living in the anxious state that a lot of Americans live in every day, you would tend to see low heart rate variability. And the general recommendation from a non-biohacking standpoint would be breath work, yoga, working on your relationships, getting a good night of sleep, de-stressing, not working too hard. And those are all great. And then if you delve into the world of something like biohacking, you have, for example, the ability to use electronic vagal nerve stimulation, meaning like electrodes directly over kind of like the auricular branch of the vagus nerve, slightly behind the ear, to be able to induce relaxation or high HRV by directly stimulating that. Cold water face dunks or cold baths or cold soaks, which kind of fit into the biohacking category. Those would also be something that would stimulate the vagus nerve. You can even use light. There are machines that will use light spectrum very similar to what you'd get from a red light bed or red light panel, but they're directly over either side of the neck. That's one example. Another example would be light sound stimulation and also haptic stimulation. There is a chair that's very common for someone with PTSD, someone with low HRV, or someone who just basically has difficulty turning their brain off. It's basically like a gravity chair that's lined with vibrational
I've seen
nodes.
those, yeah.
Yeah, and
you wear earphones,
eye mask, you wear earphones. I have one next to my office, in the room next to my office, and you sit in that thing, and it just, even in a racing brain or somebody who's just like, hard charging, high achieving, can't turn things off, you sit in that thing and you just relax. There's a little ankle band that I travel with that does something very similar. You lay in bed and it kind of vibrates the body into this relaxed state that a lot of people would normally rely on, like, a glass of wine or a Valium to achieve. And this is just using technology without any biochemical payback. Um, Final example would be using light and sound. So this is down to like the default mode network piece. Like a lot of people will shift the brain into a more malleable state or increase neuroplasticity or decrease beta brain waves and increase something like focused alpha brain waves or creative theta brain waves using in many cases it'll be like psilocybin, LSD, plant medicines, a lot of these things that might work for those conditions, but that also require, hefty amount of time off work, or, you're not going to do that at noon and be back at work, at 1 p.m. after lunch break. You can use light and sound to shift the body into a very similar state. It's a lamp that you lay underneath that flashes light almost like a strobe light, and you've got your eyes closed, but it's shifting your body into that same state. There are head-worn devices like the brain tap or the visor, and these would be more like travel friendly versions of almost like these goggles that you wear, that people will sit up from and say they feel like they've done something like a psilocybin journey without actually doing that. But more important than anything psychedelic or entheogenic is the idea that it shifts the brain. Like you feel more relaxed, you feel more creative, you feel more neuroplastic, depending on the reason that you've actually done a session like that. So, long answer to your question, but I would say another category would be just the use of technology instead of drugs to induce a certain mental state.
And have you used that stuff successfully?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they don't work better if you combine them with drugs. I know people who have tried.
How about the cold plunges?
Cold plunges, well,
They build character.
Yeah, they build character. So cold plunges get a bad rap, I think, mostly by people who don't like to be cold. And very similar to what we were talking about with heat, right? Heat shock protein and erythropoietin and cardiovascular blood flow. You see a multitude of benefits that occur from thermal stress in general. And there's obviously two sides of the coin when it comes to thermal stress, heat and cold. And with cold, you see some different mechanisms. You see an acute and immediate vasoconstrictive response as the body goes into like this sympathetic stressed out mode, followed by this vasodilatory rush. Anybody who's gotten out of like a cold plunge or a cold shower, your skin kind of looks a little lobster red afterwards. And the reason is that rebound vasodilatory blood flow that occurs that's actually good for cardiovascular health. I wear a continuous blood glucose monitor, and a lot of people are familiar with the type of things that would keep blood glucose stabilized. Going for a walk before and after a meal, lifting weights or maintaining muscle, which acts as kind of like a sink for extra glucose. Even certain herbs or drugs like berberine as an herb or metformin as a drug. All of these can impact your blood glucose variability. But one thing that surprised me when I started wearing a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, is how effective cold is at stabilizing blood glucose. It seems to have a pretty profound insulin sensitizing effect. And that could be like a cold shower before you're going to go out to a steakhouse at night and punish some of the bread bowl. It could be a morning cold plunge after a sauna session. But the glucose stabilizing effect of cold is one interesting factor that a lot of people don't think about. Another one, and this is especially interesting when you look at the fact that now we're blessed to live in this post-industrial modern era where we live and drive and sleep and work in temperature-controlled boxes, right? It's 90 some degrees in DC right now, and we're at a comfortable 68 or whatever in here. But from a resilient standpoint, the idea of being constantly comfortable, that doesn't necessarily do the body any metabolic favors. So when you are in the cold, you see a shift of metabolically inactive white adipose tissue to metabolically active brown fat. Some influencers will blow its way out of proportion and say, well, you're going to, burn an entire cheesecake in the cold plunge. And that's not true. You do see a slight increase in metabolic rate and a slight improvement in blood glucose stability that lends itself to better metabolic health. The pushback by a lot of people as well as stressful. It's like, sending your body into battle every morning if you're going to go jump in a cold plunge. And furthermore, the second thing people say is, well, it blunts the body's response to your workout, right? If you get in a cold plunge or you get cold after a workout, you will see less mitochondrial proliferation and you'll see less building of satellite cells, which help to grow new muscle. That claim is true, and so is the claim about it being excessively stressful. But for the claim about cold being excessively stressful, what you actually see in long-term studies on cold is for about the first 4 weeks, you get a cortisol response and your body gets very sympathetic. And then over time, you develop the ability to have lower cortisol throughout the day and better nervous system resilience, meaning back to that HRV thing that I mentioned, if you have a regular cold practice. And then with the don't get cold after a workout, bro, thing that people say, yes, that's true. And if you look at the actual studies that put people in cold water or in a cold room after a workout, they're leaving them in there for like 10 to 20 minutes. And you're seeing like a muscle temperature drop of 1 degree or more Celsius. That's inducing that blunting of the natural stress response that you'd normally want the body to have after workout. I don't know a lot of people who are going into a cold plunge for like 10 to 20 minutes after a workout. So the idea of just like cooling off the body for 2 or 3 minutes by taking a quick cold shower, or even just like waiting until later in the day after your workout and doing a cold plunge after an afternoon sauna or something like that is fine. And I'm a huge fan of cold plunging. And I live in Idaho, so I have to be a fan of the cold anyway. So,
And what do you think about all the fascination that we're seeing now with longevity?
it's interesting. There's like there's almost like this near transhumanistic obsession with
Yeah.
grasping at immortality, right? So, how much more can you do in your elaborate 5-hour morning routine to get just a few extra, weeks or months or years of life? And some of it's a little bit ironic because, and I'm sure you know people like this, it seems like all those extra years that people are trying to get are spent, in a hyperbaric chamber, huddled up cold and hungry and libidoless, inside some kind of a HVAC pod. And it's kind of ridiculous if you step back and look at it that way because, I mean, Lord of the Rings, right? Gollum lived a really long time. Wasn't necessarily the happiest, most fulfilled character in that book, but he had the longevity game nailed down pretty good. I think that rather than myopically focusing on living as long as possible, which can be a relatively unfulfilling pursuit at the end of the day, we should be focusing at putting more health into the years that we do have. I don't know how long, I'm programmed to live, if we want to look at things from a genetic standpoint. I think I could certainly live a little bit longer using some of the natural and the scientific protocols that we've been talking about. But more importantly, I want to be able to, throw a football around the backyard with my grandkids and climb a mountain and, and hang out and go on vacations with my wife and just be robust and vital and fit for as long as possible, as close as possible to the day that I die. And considering that the longest lived human being on record, I think, is like 117 years old, to claim that somehow in like the next decade we're going to get that to like 130 or 140 or 150 or 180 is, I think, a little bit ridiculous. And we should be focusing more on just remaining reasonably vital without it becoming a selfish pursuit, and B, filling our lives with those things that are also just as much, if not more fulfilling than the pursuit of longevity. Staying out past your bedtime with the family and, spending more time with loved ones and building relationships and throwing family dinners and doing all the things that we know. I mean, even based on like Harvard's longest running study on longevity, trump all of the PMF and the oxygen and the peptides and the stem cells and the red light, and that's the amount of and the quality of love and relationships in your life. So I'm not opposed to living healthy, but I do think that some people kind of like take it too far.
So you're not going to move in with Brian Johnson?
I mean, if he invited me, I'd probably go for a few days just to see what it was like. Yeah. I'd probably head home to Idaho pretty quick.
Ben, thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Really, really good fun. Thank you.
Thanks.